The first thing I do every morning when I step into the courthouse is pause at the door for a moment. It's an old habit of mine. Some people say it's a superstition. I suppose maybe it is, but for me, it's simply a reminder. My father used to tell me something when I was young. He was a police officer for nearly 40 years, and every morning before he left for work, he would stand in our small kitchen with a cup of coffee and say the same thing. Son, the uniform doesn't give you authority, the way you treat people does. I have carried that sentence with me my entire life. Even now, decades later, when I walk into the courtroom and put on the black robe, I still hear his voice in my head. The courthouse itself is older than most of the buildings around it. The floors creak if you walk too quickly, and the air always smells faintly like paper and wood polish. Some mornings there is also the scent of coffee drifting down the hallway from the clerk's office. It's not a grand building, no marble columns, no towering ceilings, just wooden benches, fluorescent lights, and a room where people come hoping someone will listen. I've been sitting on that bench for more than 30 years now, long enough to see thousands of cases pass through those doors, long enough to know that most of the people who stand in front of me are not criminals in the way movies like to portray them. They're tired, they're worried, sometimes they're embarrassed. A missed payment, a bad decision behind the wheel, a mistake made during a stressful moment. Life has a way of piling problems on top of people until they eventually land in a place like my courtroom, and when they do, my job is simple. Listen carefully, be fair, and never forget that every person standing in that room has a story that started long before they walked through the door. That particular morning began like many others. My clerk, Daniel Mercer, was already seated at his desk when I walked in. Daniel is the kind of man who rarely shows emotion, but his eyebrows tell the truth long before his voice does. After 10 years working together, I've learned that when Daniel raises one eyebrow, something unusual is about to happen. That morning, both eyebrows were raised. "Morning, Judge," he said, adjusting a stack of files. "Morning, Daniel," I replied. He handed me the day's docket. I scanned the list quickly. Parking disputes, speeding tickets, a minor insurance issue, nothing remarkable. Traffic court rarely makes headlines. Most days, it's just ordinary people trying to sort out ordinary problems. And I like it that way. Before the session began, I looked out at the gallery. A handful of people were already seated on the wooden benches. Some were scrolling through their phones. Others sat quietly, rehearsing what they planned to say. I've always believed that the courtroom is a strange place emotionally. Fear and hope often sit right beside each other on those benches. Officer Ramirez, the bailiff that morning, stepped to the front of the room. "Court is now in session," he announced. The room rose to its feet, and I took my seat behind the bench. The first few cases unfolded exactly the way you would expect. A college student who forgot to renew his registration. A delivery driver who accidentally parked in a restricted loading zone. An elderly man who insisted the traffic camera had captured the wrong license plate. Daniel later confirmed that the camera had indeed made an error. It happens more often than people think. Small things, simple resolutions, justice in its quiet everyday form. But sometime around mid-morning, Daniel slid a new file across the desk toward me, and I noticed something immediately. The paper was thicker than usual. The file was heavier too. That alone doesn't always mean much, but over the years I've learned to trust certain instincts. Daniel didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He simply looked at me for a moment and gave the smallest shake of his head. That was his way of saying, "This one might be different." Officer Ramirez cleared his throat and read from the docket. Case number 2147, State versus Nathaniel Carter. A young man stood up from the defense table. He looked confident. Too confident, if I'm being honest. Perfect suit, expensive watch. The kind of calm posture that usually belongs to someone who has never had to worry about consequences before. I've seen that posture before. It rarely ends well. Then my eyes moved to the other side of the courtroom, and that's when I noticed the woman. She stood quietly beside the prosecutor's table, simple clothes, one arm resting in a medical brace. Her teenage son stood beside her, holding a folder so tightly his knuckles had turned white. I didn't know their story yet, but I could already tell something about the room had changed. The calm rhythm of an ordinary morning had just shifted, and I had a feeling this case was about to test everything my father taught me about authority, fairness, and the responsibility that comes with sitting behind this bench. Officer Ramirez read the charges slowly and clearly so there would be no confusion. Reckless driving, failure to obey a traffic signal, leaving the scene of an accident involving bodily injury. The room grew noticeably quieter as each charge was spoken. Those are not minor traffic violations. When someone leaves an injured person behind on the road, the case stops being routine. I looked down at the file for a moment before raising my eyes again. "Mr. Carter," I said calmly, "please step forward." Nathaniel Carter approached the podium with the easy confidence of someone who believed the outcome had already been decided. His shoulders were relaxed. His hands rested casually on the edge of the stand as if he were leaning against a bar counter instead of standing in a courtroom. Beside him stood his attorney, a polished man named Gregory Hale. I recognized him immediately. Mr. Hale had represented a number of high-profile clients in the city. He was articulate, experienced, and rarely unprepared. On the other side of the room stood the woman I had noticed earlier. Her name, according to the file, was Elena Ramirez. She worked as a night janitor at a public high school a few miles from the courthouse. The medical brace on her arm confirmed what the report already said. The collision had fractured her wrist. Next to her was her son, Diego, 16 years old, quiet, watchful, still holding that thick folder. "Good morning, Ms. Ramirez," I said. "Good morning, Your Honor," she replied softly. Her voice was steady, though I could see the fatigue in her eyes. People who work overnight shifts carry a particular kind of exhaustion with them. It settles into the corners of the face. I nodded and turned back toward the defense. "Mr. Hale," I said, "you may proceed." The attorney adjusted his jacket and stepped forward. "Your Honor, while my client acknowledges that a traffic incident occurred, we dispute the characterization presented in the charges. The intersection where this event took place is known for confusing signal timing, particularly during afternoon congestion." He spoke with practiced smoothness. "It is entirely possible that the collision resulted from a malfunction or a misinterpretation of the traffic signal. Additionally, the allegation that Mr. Carter knowingly left an injured party is speculative." Nathaniel Carter nodded slightly as his attorney spoke, as though the explanation matched exactly what he expected to hear. I listened carefully. 30 years on the bench teaches you that sometimes confidence is earned, and sometimes it is borrowed. When Mr. Hale finished, I turned toward the prosecutor. Assistant District Attorney Melissa Grant stood up with a thin binder in her hands. "Your Honor," she said, "the state believes the evidence will demonstrate that this was not an accident caused by confusion. It was reckless behavior followed by a deliberate attempt to avoid responsibility." She placed the binder on the table and opened it. Before she could continue, Nathaniel Carter let out a quiet laugh. Not loud enough to be openly disrespectful, but loud enough that everyone in the room heard it. I looked up slowly. "Is something amusing, Mr. Carter?" I asked. He shook his head with a smirk. "No, Your Honor. I was just thinking this is all a little dramatic." The gallery shifted uneasily. Diego Ramirez tightened his grip on the folder. Ms. Grant continued. "At approximately 3:42 p.m. on October 12th, Ms. Ramirez entered the intersection of Hillcrest Avenue and Monroe Street on a green light. Mr. Carter approached from the west in a silver sports vehicle traveling at a high rate of speed." She turned a page. "Witnesses state he never slowed down." I glanced at Elena Ramirez. She stood quietly, eyes lowered. Ms. Grant went on. "The impact pushed Ms. Ramirez's car across the intersection and into a traffic barrier. After the collision, Mr. Carter exited his vehicle, looked inside her car, then returned to his own vehicle and drove away." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Leaving the scene of an accident is not just illegal, it reveals something about a person's character. Mr. Hale stepped forward again. Your Honor, my client denies that interpretation. Nathaniel Carter finally spoke. Look, he said, shrugging slightly. Things happen on the road. It's not like anyone died. The words landed heavily in the room. Elena Ramirez lifted her eyes for the first time. She didn't say anything, but the expression on her face carried more weight than any argument. I folded my hands on the desk. This case was already beginning to reveal something important, not just about what happened at that intersection, but about the kind of young man standing in front of me, and the quiet strength of the woman standing across from him. And I had the distinct feeling that whatever happened next was going to make the entire courtroom pay very close attention. I have learned something over the years about moments like this. When arrogance enters a courtroom, it usually arrives before the truth, but the truth has a way of catching up if you give it time. Assistant District Attorney Melissa Grant stepped closer to the evidence monitor mounted beside the clerk's desk. Your Honor, she said, the state would like to begin by presenting the first piece of evidence. She reached into the binder and handed a flash drive to Daniel. My clerk plugged it into the system and the monitor flickered to life. The screen showed the corner of Hillcrest Avenue and Monroe Street, a wide intersection, 2 lanes on each side, the kind of place where drivers sometimes treat the road like a racetrack if they believe no one is watching. This footage, Ms. Grant explained, comes from a nearby pharmacy security camera. The video began to play. For a few seconds, nothing unusual happened. Cars passed through the intersection normally. Pedestrians waited at the crosswalk. Then Elena Ramirez's small sedan entered the frame. She moved slowly and carefully through the green light. From the opposite side of the screen, another vehicle appeared, a silver sports car. Fast, too fast for a city street. The car didn't slow down as it approached the intersection. It didn't hesitate. It didn't even appear to brake. The collision happened in an instant. Metal struck metal with a force that shook the camera. Elena Ramirez's car spun sideways and slammed against a concrete barrier near the corner. The room fell completely silent. The video continued. The sports car rolled to a stop a few yards away. The driver's door opened. Nathaniel Carter stepped out. He walked toward the damaged sedan and looked through the driver's window. Even through the grainy camera footage, you could see Elena Ramirez moving inside the car, trying to lift her injured arm. Nathaniel stood there for several seconds. Then he turned around. He got back into his car and drove away. A low wave of disbelief moved through the gallery. I glanced toward Nathaniel Carter. The confidence he had shown earlier had faded slightly. His jaw was tight, and his eyes were fixed on the table. His attorney leaned toward him and whispered something urgently. Ms. Grant clicked the remote and paused the footage. Your Honor, she said calmly, this video confirms that the defendant ran a red light and left an injured driver behind. Mr. Hale stood immediately. Your Honor, the footage does not conclusively show the traffic signal. Ms. Grant nodded. You're correct, Mr. Hale. That's why the state has additional evidence. She turned another page in her binder. This next item was provided by the victim's son. Every head in the courtroom turned toward Diego Ramirez. The teenager hesitated for a moment before stepping forward. His hands were still gripping the thick folder he had carried since the beginning of the hearing. Ms. Grant accepted the folder and removed a printed photograph. This, she said, holding it up, is a still image taken from Ms. Ramirez's dashboard camera. Daniel placed the photo under the document camera so the entire room could see. The image was clear. Elena Ramirez's windshield view showed the intersection just seconds before the collision, and right above the traffic lanes. The signal glowed bright red. A murmur spread across the gallery again. Nathaniel Carter shifted in his seat. Ms. Grant continued. After the crash, Ms. Ramirez's son recovered the dash cam from the vehicle before it was taken for repairs. The footage was preserved and turned over to investigators. Mr. Hale cleared his throat. We will review the authenticity of that footage in due course, he said. Of course, Ms. Grant replied evenly. She closed the binder for a moment and looked directly at me. However, Your Honor, there is one more piece of evidence that the court should hear. She reached into the folder again and removed a small recording device. After the accident, she explained, Ms. Ramirez began receiving phone calls encouraging her to withdraw the complaint. The room became very still. Her son suggested recording the calls. Ms. Grant pressed a button. A man's voice filled the courtroom speakers. Ms. Ramirez, it would be wise for you to reconsider pursuing this matter. These kinds of cases can become complicated. The voice paused briefly. It would be unfortunate if unnecessary attention affected your employment or your family. The message ended. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had happened so far. Diego Ramirez lowered his head slightly. Elena placed her uninjured hand on his shoulder. Across the room, Nathaniel Carter leaned back in his chair. For the first time that morning, the easy confidence was gone, but something else replaced it. Frustration. And then slowly he looked directly at me. There was a strange calm in his expression, the kind of calm someone shows when they believe they still hold the winning card. He exhaled and spoke casually, as though the evidence in front of us meant very little. Judge, he said, you're making this a lot bigger than it really is. He shrugged. My family knows people who deal with situations like this all the time. The words hung in the air, and in that moment I understood something very clearly. Nathaniel Carter still believed that influence could outrun the truth. What he didn't realize yet was that truth had already caught him. For a few seconds after Nathaniel Carter spoke, no one in the courtroom moved. The words he had chosen were casual, almost careless, but the meaning behind them was clear enough for everyone in the room to understand. My family knows people who deal with situations like this all the time. It wasn't a threat exactly, it was something quieter than that, something colder, an assumption. I folded my hands on the desk in front of me and looked directly at him. Mr. Carter, I said slowly, I want to make sure I understand what you meant by that statement. He shrugged slightly, leaning back in his chair. I'm just saying this shouldn't have gotten this far, he replied. Things like this usually get handled privately. The gallery stirred again. His attorney immediately leaned forward. Your Honor, my client did not intend. I raised one hand gently, and Mr. Hale stopped speaking. I think your client is capable of explaining himself, I said. Nathaniel met my eyes, and that was when I saw it. Not arrogance this time, something closer to uncertainty. The evidence had changed the atmosphere of the room, and for the first time since the hearing began, he seemed to realize that the outcome might not follow the script he expected. I leaned back slightly in my chair. Mr. Carter, I said, I have spent more than 3 decades sitting on this bench. I have seen people make mistakes, serious ones. I have seen drivers panic after accidents. I have seen fear lead people to make very poor decisions. I paused for a moment. But there is one thing I have never accepted in this courtroom. I looked toward Elena Ramirez and her son standing quietly beside the prosecutor's table. The belief that responsibility can be avoided simply because someone has influence. Nathaniel Carter said nothing. The room was so quiet you could hear the faint buzzing of the lights overhead. On October 12th, I continued, you drove through a red light at a speed that put everyone around you in danger. I tapped the evidence file with my finger. The video shows it clearly. I turned another page. After the collision, you stepped out of your vehicle and looked inside the car you had just struck. You saw the driver injured, another pause, and you left. His shoulders lowered slightly. Then, according to the evidence presented today, someone attempted to pressure the victim into abandoning this case. Nathaniel shifted uncomfortably. I'm going to be very clear about something, I said. This courtroom does not operate on influence. The words landed heavily in the silence. The only things that matter in this room are facts, responsibility, and the harm that was done. I straightened the papers in front of me. Mr. Carter, you endangered the public, caused serious injury, and left an injured person behind on the side of the road. His attorney began to rise again. Your Honor, sit down, Mr. Hale. The attorney slowly returned to his chair. I looked back at Nathaniel. For reckless driving and failure to obey a traffic signal, this court is imposing a fine of $10,000. A few quiet murmurs rippled through the gallery. For leaving the scene of an accident involving injury, your driver's license is suspended for 24 months. Nathaniel's head lifted slightly. He hadn't expected that. During that time, I continued, you will also complete 300 hours of community service. He frowned. Your service will take place at the City Rehabilitation Center that assists victims of traffic collisions. I could see the realization spreading across his face. You will meet people whose lives were permanently changed by moments like the one shown in that video. The room remained silent as I continued. You will listen to their stories. You will assist with their recovery programs. And you will learn exactly what responsibility looks like after a careless decision behind the wheel. Nathaniel swallowed hard. This sentence is not about humiliation, I said calmly. It is about understanding. I turned to Elena Ramirez. Ms. Ramirez, the court also orders full financial compensation for your medical expenses and the loss of your vehicle. She nodded slowly, her eyes shining but steady. I returned my attention to Nathaniel Carter. Influence might open doors in many places, I said. But in this courtroom, responsibility walks in alone. For the first time since the hearing began, Nathaniel Carter lowered his eyes. And in that moment, the young man who had walked into the courtroom believing the rules did not apply to him finally began to understand that they did. Courtrooms are strange places after everyone leaves. The tension disappears almost instantly, like a storm that passes and leaves the air quiet again. The benches sit empty, the papers are stacked, and the echo of voices fades into the background hum of the building. That afternoon, after the final case was finished and the doors were closing for the day, I remained seated behind the bench for a few minutes longer than usual. It's something I do sometimes after a difficult hearing. My father used to say that the most important part of responsibility comes after the decision is made. When the room is empty and no one is watching, that's when you ask yourself whether you were fair. I thought about Elena Ramirez. I thought about the long nights she spent cleaning classrooms so students could walk into a tidy school the next morning. I thought about the pain in her wrist, the damaged car, and the courage it must have taken to continue pushing this case forward after those phone calls. Many people in her position would have walked away, but she didn't, and that mattered. 3 months passed before I heard anything further about the case. Most sentences fade quietly into paperwork once the hearing is over, but occasionally a report crosses my desk that makes me pause. One morning, my clerk, Daniel, knocked on the door to my chambers. He held a thin folder. You might want to see this, he said. I opened it and began reading. The report came from the rehabilitation center where Nathaniel Carter had been assigned his community service. According to the supervisor, his first few weeks had been uncomfortable for him. Not surprising. Many people who arrive there have never spent time around individuals recovering from severe injuries. Wheelchairs, therapy equipment, patients learning to walk again after accidents. It's a place that forces people to see the consequences of reckless driving in a very real way. At first, Nathaniel barely spoke to anyone. He followed instructions, kept his head down, and completed the minimum tasks required. But something slowly began to change. The report mentioned a particular afternoon when he assisted a man named Walter Green. Mr. Green had lost partial use of his legs after a collision caused by a distracted driver several years earlier. Nathaniel had been assigned to help him move between therapy rooms. During one of those walks, Mr. Green asked him a simple question. Were you the driver or the one who got hit? Nathaniel apparently paused before answering. Then he said quietly, I was the driver. Mr. Green nodded and continued walking. According to the report, That conversation lasted nearly 40 minutes. When it ended, Nathaniel returned the wheelchair to its place and sat silently for a long time. After that day, his behavior at the center changed. He began arriving early. He volunteered to assist with additional therapy sessions. He asked questions about the patient's recovery programs. The supervisor wrote that he had never seen someone listen so carefully to stories about car accidents. I closed the folder and leaned back in my chair. Not every sentence leads to transformation. Sometimes people leave a courtroom angry and unchanged, but occasionally the experience reaches them. Occasionally responsibility finds its way through the noise. A few weeks later, I received a letter addressed to the court. It was written in careful handwriting. Nathaniel Carter explained that the rehabilitation center had forced him to see something he had never considered before. Consequences do not end when a crash happens. For many people, that moment becomes the beginning of years of recovery, pain, and adjustment. At the end of the letter, he wrote one sentence that stayed with me. I thought responsibility was something that could be negotiated. Now I understand it is something you carry. I folded the letter and placed it back in the file. Later that evening, as I prepared to leave the courthouse, I passed the empty courtroom one last time. The benches were quiet again, the same room where arguments, evidence, and emotions had filled the air only months earlier, now sat peacefully under the fluorescent lights. I stood there for a moment and remembered my father's words once more. Authority doesn't come from a title. It comes from how you treat people when they stand in front of you asking to be heard. That lesson has guided me through every case I've handled. And if there is one thing I have learned after 30 years behind that bench, it is this. Justice is not measured by the size of the courtroom, the status of the people involved, or the influence someone believes they have. It is measured by whether the truth is allowed to stand. Every person who walks through those doors deserves that, and as long as I sit on that bench, that is exactly what they will receive, because the law does not belong to the powerful. It belongs to everyone.